wrote something down. What do you think they wrote down? Did you know that it was the ancient Sumerians who are credited with the first written language, followed by the ancient Egyptians? You've probably heard of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, the ancient Chinese about 1250 AD, and we have some of the earliest writing in Mesoamerica, somewhere between 600 to 900 BCE. Did you know that in ancient Mesopotamia, they made cake? That's right. They made a cake in the shape of a ziggurat. What's a ziggurat? And did you know that that cake is depicted on the white obelisk that's now in the British Museum? If you want to know more about that ancient Assyrian cake, check out tableofthegods.com. Did you know that ancient Mesopotamian cultures are also credited with some of the first narrative art and portraiture in the Western art historical tradition? Yes, here at Art Trippin, we are asking the important questions such as, what's up with their eyes? And wait, how good was that cake? For answers to these questions and more, stay tuned to this episode of Art Trippin, where we look at an introduction to the art and culture of ancient Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Devon, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin Lecture Series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Devon, and this is Art Trippin. Where in the world is ancient Mesopotamia? This is a part of the world that we would now today call the Middle East. You will see it also in art historical textbooks referred to as the ancient Near East. This is as opposed to the Far East, which we think of as East Asia. And Mesopotamia is a Greek word, and it refers to this area between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And you will see some of the greatest innovations in art and culture coming out of ancient Mesopotamia, which is why this region is often referred to as the Cradle of Civilization. It's important to note that under these civilizations, and we're going to talk about a lot of cultures, Assyrians, Sumerians, Babylonians, Neo-Babylonians, up to the Persians. When we talk about these cultures, we are looking at some of the earliest development of art and architecture related to spirituality and religious beliefs. So we'll look to the building of ziggurats and temples and the many sculptures that were destined to be housed in the temples atop such ziggurats. And of course, we will see art being used by the rulers and the people in power in ancient Mesopotamia to position themselves and keep themselves in power. Now, I kind of want to set us up in space and time. If you haven't seen the last few videos, go check those out. Those videos are about prehistoric art. So in the first video from this series, we looked at the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods. We had to do a lot of speculating in regards to why some of the art looks the way it does during this time period, because this is the time period before written history, which is what this term prehistoric refers to. So many of the observations and conclusions about the art from the Paleolithic and Neolithic eras is based on some level of conjecture, since we have no written evidence of the people from these periods. One conclusion that scholars have been able to draw up is that there definitely was, especially in the Paleolithic era, a focus on the female gendered body that served some sort of religious or spiritual meaning. And we see perhaps symbols of fertility and survival of the species in objects like the woman of Willendorf or the woman with the bison horn. We also speculated on the purpose of the cave paintings, in particular those depicting herds of animals, and we said some of the possible functions of these paintings were for protection, for teaching or storytelling, or perhaps for some kind of spiritual use. At the end of the video, we also talked about the Neolithic period, a time period when people began to settle down into communities. We see the beginning of the division of labor and the development of more skilled labor. And in terms of art, we see the beginnings of highly monumental architecture and the increased interest in visual material dedicated to the afterlife, so death practices and rituals related to spiritual ideas around life and death. Now we are heading to the part of the world that we call ancient Mesopotamia. This is roughly about modern day Iraq, some parts of Syria or Iran, what we would call today the Middle East. Before we get into this and start looking at some images, I want to make sure you understand a few key vocabulary words. The first key term that you need to understand is the concept of a city-state. When we're talking about these different cultures, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, what we're looking at are these sort of what we would call cities, but the cities are functioning almost like independent countries or states. So power is decentralized, and these different city-states are sometimes forming alliances and sometimes fighting over power. So this is not a kind of unified, centralized government here. Some other key terms that you should know the term cuneiform. This is a way to describe the first writing. Writing develops out of pictographs or images. It sort of begins as this almost glyphic language, and the syllables of this develops into written language. You should also understand the term hierarchy of scale. This refers to the idea that in an image from this time period, the figures that are represented as larger in the picture plane are going to be considered of more value or importance in the social hierarchy. And so this means a king will be depicted larger than an enslaved person. We will also see the first use of the ground line, the line that separates the sky from the earth, to create a sense of space, a real space in a pictorial plane. And we will see the introduction of registers. These are sort of areas that are delineated and separated off in an image. You will also see the term ziggurat. What's a ziggurat? A ziggurat is a raised platform. It's sort of trapezoidal shape that is used to lift a temple off the ground and up closer to the sky to bring that temple higher to the gods. You might also hear the term facade in this video. This refers to the exterior front of a building. And we will see that these are starting to be decorated with imagery in this time period. What we will see when we talk about ancient Mesopotamia are these city-states, and some of the names that you will hear of these city-states are Ur. There's a very famous cemetery in Ur that was full of objects that are of interest to art historians. We will also talk about Uruk, Babylon, Persepolis, and the ancient Persians. We will look at some key historical figures, including Hammurabi, who's known for the Law Code of Hammurabi, and the ruler Nebuchadnezzar, who's known for the Ishtar Gate. We will also see the introduction of a really important deity who is called Inanna and is sometimes referred to or conflated with other goddesses such as Ishtar in the Western tradition. When we're talking about this area known as the Fertile Crescent, sometimes this is referred to as the Cradle of Civilization. We're talking about ancient Mesopotamia, Persia, and Egypt. This area around the Tigris and Euphrates and the Nile rivers is where we see some of the earliest development of culture and, for our purposes, art history in the Western tradition. First, we will look at the Sumerians. They're dated to about 3500 to 2332 BCE. This is the time period that the Sumerians are in power. And they are known for their ziggurats, that are these platforms to lift up the temples, and their narrative devices. And in particular, we will talk in another video about the standard of Ur and narrative imagery. We will also look to the Akkadians, who rose to power in 2332. How do we know this? Because we have dates written down. And they stayed in power until about 2150, and we start to see the first images of divine figures And we start to see some early portraiture. They're also known for working with bronze. We will also look at imagery created by the Neo-Sumerians and the Babylonians, who were in power from about 2150 to 1600 BCE. In this period, we see the beginning of organized religion, we see the construction of temples, and almost sort of like a war for who can build the coolest, biggest ziggurat. We will look specifically at the ziggurat of Ur. We also see under Hammurabi, the Law Code of Hammurabi, and under Nebuchadnezzar, the Ishtar Gate, which is, of course, this magnificent, beautiful, stunning gate that also functions as a symbol of the power of the ruler and the state. We will also see that the Assyrians and Neo-Babylonians from about 900 to 539 BCE built fortified structures with guardian figures known as lamassus. If you're into the lamassu figures, stay tuned because we have a whole video just on the lamassu figures or guardian figures, and we will see more consolidation of power and more interest in depicting the power of the rulers through art. And then, of course, at the end of this period, we will talk about the Persian Empire, which lasted from roughly 559 BCE to 330 BCE. We will also look briefly at the palace complex at Persepolis, which was destroyed by the Greeks under Alexander the Great. The first culture we'll talk about are the Sumerians. The Sumerians are credited with the first writing system, and writing really grows out of drawing images. So here you can see an image of a bowl or an image of a head and a bowl, a person eating, and this evolves into the compound word or the verb to eat. So this develops over centuries into a stylized version of an image and then ultimately written language. What was written down? A lot of people think, or maybe I romantically think, that the things that would be written down would be poetry and songs and spiritual texts. But some of the first writing is very basic. It's almost like a receipt. And we'll see documentation of ownership of items or of barter or trade of items. So like, I'll trade you 3 sheep for 2 goats or whatever it might be. So the first writing is really of a practical nature. Some of the first monumental architecture that we'll see in ancient Mesopotamia is the aforementioned ziggurat. So the Sumerians are building temples dedicated to their gods, and then they're creating elite objects that they're placing in these temples to honor their deities. And we see the beginning of something that happens even now in 2025. Rulers using religion to help consolidate their power. Rulers were understood as being representatives of these gods and goddesses on earth. So in order to keep the favor of the gods and maintain their political legitimacy in the eyes of the people, the rulers had to erect these monumental temples built in honor of their deities. Here we're looking at the White Temple and Ziggurat of Uruk in modern-day Iraq, dated to about 3200 to 3000 BCE, and the temple here was most likely dedicated to Anu, a sky deity. Now, this would have been originally whitewashed, which is why it's referred to as the White Temple, and it was located in the city of Uruk, one of the city-states that made up Sumer, and it had a population of about 40,000 people. It was a very densely populated city, and this structure had a prominent position in the city. It served as sort of the city center. So it was kind of a city within the city. There would have been religious rituals taking place here, but also political speeches. We would also see people gathering at the foot of the ziggurat to partake in trade or commerce. So this was really where the people in the city would come together and interact on a regular basis. This ziggurat is made of mud bricks, so it's literally just mud formed together in these bricks and set out to dry in the sun. They did not really have access to large stone quarries where they could have attained large rocks. And so they built these ziggurats out of mud bricks, which is why many of these ziggurats are in a state of disrepair, because mud brick is notoriously not sturdy and reliable. And so this probably was covered in a kind of plaster and whitewashed, and it would have had painted decorations. It would have required a massive massive amount of labor to build this structure, so it indicates that there was a really strong leader in power who could motivate the people to construct this temple. On top of the ziggurat would have been a really small temple. And the use of the ziggurats really reflects the Sumerian belief that the gods were above the world of the humans and that one approached the world of the gods by being higher up. So we see these structures that are lifted and raised. You will also see on the ziggurats the use of staircases and ramps that move people up the ziggurat. So there was a kind of procession that would have been important in a Sumerian or ancient Mesopotamian ritual. You will also notice that the temple on top is really small. Not everybody gets to go in there. That's the VIP area. Are you on the list? If you are not on the list, you are down below with the people. Who's at the top? The rulers and the priests, people who are working together to keep each other in power. Another really important object from the Sumerians is the Standard of Ur, where we see a depiction of Sumerian warfare and a Sumerian sort of festival in the time of peace. If you want to know more about the Standard of Ur, stay tuned for our next video in which I'll dive deep into this object. You'll see a similar visual style that you see in the Standard of Ur here in this bull-headed harp with inlaid sound box. This is from a royal tomb in the ancient city of Ur. And here we see the use of gold. We see the use of lapis lazuli that comes from Afghanistan. So here at Ur, we have an economy based on the trade of precious materials. That's right, I'm talking about money. Gold is not mined in Mesopotamia. Lapis lazuli comes from Afghanistan. So here we're seeing precious objects used to show off the wealth and the power of the elite in ancient Mesopotamia. We also start to see the first images of deities. You'll see a goddess referred to as Inanna by the Sumerians. The Akkadians call her Ishtar. This is a kind of pan-Mesopotamian goddess, the sort of queen of heaven and earth, a goddess of love and fertility, but also war and power. And we see images like the depiction of the goddess Inanna and the presentation of offerings to Inanna, in which we see the introduction of the ground line. This is that line that is positioning the figures in a real space. And here you can see on the Warka vase, they are walking in a line carrying offerings of food, animal, crops, and precious objects, carrying these offerings to the goddess Inanna. Perhaps some of my favorite images by the Sumerians are these statuettes of worshippers. These come from a temple and they're dated to about 2700 BCE. They're carved out of gypsum and then inlaid with shell and black limestone, and they come in varying sizes. Here, one of the larger figures, this large male figure, is 2.5 feet tall. These are now housed in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. Here we're looking at these Sumerian votive figures, and the first thing that you notice is, yes, these eyes. What's up with these eyes? So these figures are not depictions of kings or people in power, but these are stand-ins for the patrons who are approaching the gods. As we saw in the Orca vase, people would bring offerings to the deities. So here, if you cannot properly attend to the deity at all hours of the day, you've got to be out in the fields farming or doing your other business, you can create a replica of yourself, a statuette of yourself that you can offer to the goddess that can stay in the temple with its eyes alert and perhaps holding an offering in its hand, a candle or some kind of offering to the deity, through these worshippers. And in this way, through these statues, through these Sumerian votive figures, the people could be ever present in devotion to the deities. These votive figures would be placed in niches, both outside the temples and atop the ziggurats, to appease the gods, the ancestors, the spirit world. And loyalty to one's city-state was equal to loyalty to the city's patron deity. So what we're seeing at sacred spaces here for the Sumerians is a level of exclusivity, who was allowed up at the top and who had to remain down below. We also see a use of material wealth and decoration, expensive materials as a way to show off power. And this is also a way for patrons to honor the deities and honor the gods. We also see the beginning of ritual and ceremony, repetitive actions with symbolic significance, like a procession climbing up the ziggurat. We also see that these ziggurats are placed at the center of the city. It's an important place both civically and in terms of religion and spirituality. And the sacred space and the art and architecture of the sacred space are used to lend legitimacy to those in power. From this time period, we also see the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is sort of the founding myth of this civilization and is generally regarded as the earliest surviving great work of literature. So the Sumerians are credited with many firsts in Western civilization, but we see this with lots of ancient cultures in Mesopotamia. Let's look, for example, to the Akkadians. Here we're looking at the head of the Akkadian ruler, dated to about 2250 to 2200 BCE, and this is a bronze sculpture. You can see that the eye here is missing. The left eye appears to have been attacked and damaged purposefully at some point during its history. But this image is important because it is perhaps one of the earliest portraits. Perhaps this is a depiction of the Akkadian ruler Sargon. It's a life-size bronze head with a very sharp geometric clarity. You can see the locks of the hair, the curled lips, the wrinkled brow, and the very detailed texture of the beard. It's an incredibly individualistic image, so we really think this is a portrait, not just a general idea of a human, but a depiction of a very specific person, perhaps the Akkadian ruler Sargon. You'll see the typical Mesopotamian style, which is very stylized and abstracted. It's not entirely naturalistic, but it of course appears to be a depiction of a very specific person. We also see that this is an early example of bronze cast sculpture. This is an additive process where a sculpture is built up, and this is a really new artistic technology at the time. We also see more ziggurats. Here we're looking at the Neo-Sumerian ziggurat of Ur in modern-day Iraq, which has been reconstructed in the modern era. And fun fact, back in the day, when I first started teaching, I had a student who was a US veteran, and he showed me pictures that he had when he was stationed in Iraq, and he had been to see this in person. So you've probably seen this in the news at some point back in the day. When we look to ancient Babylonian art, we can see a really important image and document in the law code of Hammurabi. This is from modern day Iran, dated to about 1780 BCE, and is currently housed in the Louvre in Paris. This is a stele. This is a fancy art history word that means long, tall, vertical stone sculpture. This is an ancient stone slab that is covered with writing on the bottom half, which is a sort of law code, and it dictates what happens when someone breaks the law. So if someone steals property from a temple, they shall be put to death. If a man's wife is caught in bed with another man, both shall be tied up and thrown in the water. You will see that these laws are sometimes draconian by modern standards, and that the punishments for women are a lot harsher than those for men. But however, this law code really forms the basis of some of modern law in the Western world. On the top of the stele, you'll see an image of Hammurabi in front of the deity. So here the idea is that these laws and rules have been given from the gods to Hammurabi, and Hammurabi gives these to the people. Now let's head to ancient Assyria and check out these Lascaux figures. This is a sort of hybrid creature that is part animal, part human, often with a lion or a bull's body, huge wings, and then a human head. And if you want to know more about Assyrian Lascaux figures, stay tuned for a future video in which we discuss Assyrian Lascaux figures in detail. Moving through these cultures, we come upon the Neo-Babylonians, and here we are looking at a restoration of the Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate was originally located in modern-day Iraq. Now this is housed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. The museum is currently, as of 2025, closed, but is under remodeling and renovation and set to reopen at some future date. Here we're looking at a detail from the Ishtar Gate. We can see this lion figure, and the lion figure throughout ancient Mesopotamia is associated with rulership, with the king's power. The Ishtar Gate was one of the many gates that entrance to the great ancient city of Babylon. This was seen as a very prominent visual demarcation, sort of lining the entrance into the city, creating a sense of awe and wonder in the traveler or the person arriving to this great city. On the exterior of the gate, we see these brilliantly glazed blue stones. This brilliant blue would have shimmered in the sunlight. We see depictions of animals associated with divine power and with the power of the kings. And then we see, importantly, writing. On the exterior of the Ishtar Gate, we see some cuneiform text that basically says, this gate has been built by the ruler Nebuchadnezzar. So we know who's the patron of this structure. And to wrap up this video on ancient Mesopotamia, let's look to Persepolis. And here we're looking at the Apadana, or audience hall, and we're looking at a frieze. A frieze is like a register. It is a kind of rectangular space that's delineated. And here we see a procession of individuals. They appear to be kings, people in power from other city-states, and they appear to be bringing offerings to the ruler here at Persepolis. This procession leads up to the rulers, and here we see Darius and Xerxes receiving these offerings from these people of honor. This is located in modern-day Iran, carved out of limestone, and dated to about 521 to 465 BCE. Hopefully this video has given you a good introduction to the art, architecture, and culture of ancient Mesopotamia. And now I want to get back to that cake. If you check out Table of Gods, I found them on socials, but you can also go to tableofgods.com. You can find many ancient recipes, including this recipe for this ancient Assyrian cake that features honey and pistachios and lots of other delicious things. In fact, I'm getting hungry. I think I should go bake a cake. If you enjoyed this video on the art of ancient Mesopotamia, please give us a like and a follow. Subscribe to Art Trippin here on YouTube and on TikTok. You can also check us out on Instagram at Art Trippin with Prof D. As always, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debon, and this has been Art Trippin, the lecture series. With its eyes alert and perhaps holding an offering in its hand, a candle or some kind of